parents sometimes, they themselves are very much into using screens for entertainment. Dads like to play video games, moms like social media. The kids grow up and they see, well, that's what you do when you have spare time. And so they're going to be naturally attracted. So in a way, we have to conform ourselves to the ideal that we would have for our children and not demonstrate in our preferences the opposite of what we are hoping in their life. We have to start with ourselves. That would be my thought.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Welcome to another edition of Homeschool Talks. I'm Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and I get to talk to interesting people in the world of homeschooling. And today I'm joined by a very interesting person, Andrew Pudewa, the founder and director of Institute for Excellence in Writing. He is also a homeschool dad of 7 himself, and a very sought after and in-demand speaker in all things homeschooling. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Jim. It's always good to talk with you.
Well, as we're talking, I'm going to ask you a question that I feel like I should know the answer to, and I'm sure that people will be interested in, but I don't actually know the answer to this. How did you and your family get into homeschooling?
Yeah, well, we were living in Bozeman, Montana, and the 2 oldest girls, who are actually stepchildren to me, but when I married my wife, she had a couple kids. I had a 3-year-old. They were in a small, like a little cottage school. It was just a mom in her house, and she taught a bunch of kids. It was kind of Montessori-ish, and it was a really good environment, and we were happy with that, but then she had to stop doing it. So then, okay, what do we do? My wife has a degree in elementary education, so it's kind of like, well, schools, but what are the schools? We're super tight. I mean, very poor. We were poor. So the private schools were kind of out of the question. The public schools were definitely out of the question. So it was kind of, well, I guess we'll have to homeschool. But we didn't know very many people in Bozeman at that time. It was a pretty sparse group. But we found a few people and started and kept going and pretty much never looked back. We've had almost all the children at home for almost all the years. I put 1 or 2 kids in school for short periods of time, and I've regretted it every time. So finally, I just swore it off.
What era would that have been when you first started homeschooling in Bozeman, Montana?
It would have been the 90s. So 1990 is when we first started there. And we lived in Bozeman till about 93, and then we moved a few times during that whole decade. I started IEW in 95. We were living in Moscow, Idaho. And then I went full-time in 99 when we moved to California. So most of the kids would consider California home, and we had a really good homeschool group there in California, Central Coast, San Luis Obispo County. And that's kind of where things really started to connect up and grow and explode, both on a family and personal basis, as well as the business side.
Well, let's talk about the business side. How did you get started with the Institute for Excellence in Writing?
Yeah, so in the early 90s, I was working, actually, with a small school in Montana. And this school sent their faculty to Canada to learn this program called the Blended Soundsight Program of Learning. And it was kind of a phonics-based reading, kind of a reaction to modern and progressivism in the Canadian schools. So I went up there with some of the teachers. I took this 10-day teacher training course, and I learned the structure and style writing program. And I came back and I used it a little bit, and then we started homeschooling. So I taught it to my kids and some of their friends and did a little extra. I was still teaching violin full time. So I didn't have a lot of time to do it. But then I was always looking for kind of a side gig to make a little extra money so that I could afford to be a music teacher. And I tried a few different weird businesses, but then I got this idea, oh, I could teach a seminar on this writing program, and it would fit really well because it's so similar in so many ways to Suzuki method. In fact, when I first saw it, I thought that is a Suzuki method for teaching English composition. So I put together a little seminar handout, and I got I got 20 people to pay $40 to listen to me talk for one day in 1994, which was more than I could make in a whole week teaching violin as hard as I could. So I thought this has potential. And so my original goal was just to teach a seminar once or twice a month, pull in an extra $1,000 or whatever, crack my nut for the keeping my wife home and homeschooling and doing all that. And then someone said, "Oh, you should make video of this." And I said, "Well, that's the dumbest idea I ever heard. Nobody would watch a video. It's a class. You have to be there. You have to look people in the eye. You have to, answer their questions. A video would be horrible." But I made it, and it was really, really bad. So I tried another one, and it wasn't quite so bad, and people wanted it. So, yeah, so people would call and say, "Oh, I heard you have this video. Uh, can I buy it?" And I said, "Well, you could, but it would be better if we did a live seminar in your city. So if you want to organize a place and let people know about it, I'll come and teach it." So I was very much out there trying to get people nose to nose, show them how it goes. I started doing little student classes in the beginning. So that whole period, 97, 98, 99, 2000, 2001, I was traveling more, teaching violin less. And then in 2000, the scales tipped. I was making more money running around teaching seminars and selling videotapes than I was teaching music. So it all worked out pretty well. But I got my first actual employee in 2002, and it just started to grow from there. And people invited me to speak at homeschool conventions, which was one of my most favorite places to go. And so I started to meet some of the different state leaders and group leaders in various places all over the country. Got a chance to travel a little bit internationally, do some things for some homeschoolers in places like Africa. Went to Kenya, been to Malaysia for some missionaries, been to China, did some work for them, and Canada, been to Canada many times. So that's kind of the slow, gradual development. And 20 years goes by awfully fast, doesn't it, Jim?
Yes, it does. So it's interesting to me that when we first started homeschooling, so my wife was pretty well sold on the idea from, even when we were engaged. I mean, if we had kids, she wanted to homeschool for sure. And I was a little bit leery of the idea. And it's interesting that, do you remember a program called The Writing Road to Reading?
Oh, yes. The Spalding. Yes, we had that too. That was one of the only things that was around back then.
Right. Well, that was something. So I took, I don't know, 2 or 3 days off from work, and we lived in Corvallis, Oregon at the time. Debbie signed us up, and I went up and went through the seminar with them in Portland. And it was kind of the thing that, I don't know how, everything gets added in together, but it was, I think we could really do this thing. Our kid was 4 or 5 years old at the time, and it was really encouraging because I imagine you would agree with me that teaching children to read and write is kind of the gateway to all manner of learning. And for me, that was really important.
Yeah, definitely. We saw kind of this rise of, in the world of reading, we had waves of this kind of look-say method, and then there was the whole language approach. And so around that time, the teaching of phonics in schools had become kind of disrespected, marginalized, and they were trying all these new techniques to teach reading and spelling and writing. And it wasn't working that well, but people kept doing it thinking, well, if we keep doing it, maybe it'll get better. Whereas the homeschool world figured it out pretty quick. That stuff isn't working. Let's find what does. And that more traditional approach was really a mainstay, I think, for many of us. And we all have a debt of gratitude to the people who wrote those books and the publishers, Abeka, Bob Jones, made their stuff available to us, because it wasn't like a homeschool convention today where you can walk in a huge room and have 400 things to look at and figure out what to choose from.
So, as a homeschooler yourself, and in a business that sells useful and valuable products to homeschooling families, and as a kind of movement leader yourself, traveling around the world and the country, what looking back on all these decades ago, what's the biggest change that you've seen?
Well, I think the one I mentioned would be a significant one, which is just the myriad, the extent of curricular materials that have been created and are now available. And that's kind of a double edger there, because on one hand, there's so much to choose from, and you've got kids with special circumstances or needs or interests, and you can often find something that is really good for that child or your children in your situation. But it also can create a little bit of decision fatigue and overwhelm, especially for the new homeschool mom. Whereas it used to be, here's the stack of stuff, you can do this. Now it's you have a lot of research and homeschooling styles and philosophies, and so there's an upside to it and a downside to it. That'd be the first difference. Another difference, I think, that's very positive is there's just more community options. A lot of people, like when we first started in Bozeman, we didn't really know anyone, and there's no group. There was no social opportunity for the kids. But by the time, 10 years later, we're in California, had more kids. Now we had a group, and we could do plays and Civil War ball dances, and, someone would volunteer to teach classes. And it wasn't like a formal co-op, but there were lots of ways for our kids to meet other homeschool kids. And now, of course, we've got, almost institutional enrichment programs, from classical conversation style to hybrid schools to online cohorts of kids that get together and talk to each other online. That kind of came up during COVID. Debate tournaments now are all over the country, NCFCA, STOA. So I think the social opportunities are vast and a huge blessing to most of us. The third difference, I would say, is just the rise of screens and how that has changed the nature of home education, both with more opportunities, but also with some accompanying dangers.
Yeah, I think that's a topic of great interest to many parents today, especially in a more faith-based Christian community as well as homeschooling community. What do you think are the upsides, and then maybe after that, what are the risks?
Well, as a person who sells video courses and a company that has online classes to go with those video courses, I know there's a lot of power in that. I get letters almost every day from kids who say, something like, I'm taking your course on, the internet, or I'm taking your video writing class and I really like it. And I've learned this and this, and you're funny. And sometimes they give me suggestions like, it would be better if you did, kids, they're always going to have. So I'm acutely aware of the power of video to bring a person to you that you wouldn't be able to ever meet somewhere else. I think we see that as a huge upside. What concerns me is the rise of software and web-based things that are more geared toward entertainment, or what the buzzword in the schools of education is edutainment. Like we can we can entertain and educate at the same time. And so then you get into this interactive thing, and you get programs that are designed to teach kids, how to read on a screen, and how to spell on a screen, and how to do math on a screen. And pretty much all the research that I have found on the subject of screens and education technology is that better learning happens on paper. Kids learn to read better on paper than they do on screens. Comprehension of reading is better on paper than it is on screen. Handwriting does things for the brain that is infinitely better than typing or drawing letters on a screen, or touching letters to spell words. Math, it used to be that you'd use paper only when you couldn't do a math problem in your head. And now people are very dependent on technology. And I think in a way that the technology is atrophying the skills which it replaces. So we have spell checkers, we have calculators, we have things that will anticipate you want. Now we have Chat GPT. So we're in a brave new world, and nobody knows what that's going to look like. So I think, in the homeschooling world, we see an approach to technology a little bit cautious. I think a lot of parents just have an instinctive knowledge that it's really not good for kids to be staring at screens for hour a day, and, touching screens rather than turning pages in a book. So we'll see how that goes. I do think the conversation around Chat GPT is the most timely and interesting, just because nobody knows what is that going to do to all of us? How's that going to change us as adults, who are pretty much, solid in whatever we know, whatever we do, we can do. Kids are, of course, in a developmental stage. Schools have been careening headlong into more screens in the classroom, more tech, replace teachers with AI kinds of stuff. Give every second and third grader a Chromebook connected to the internet, and they'll learn more. Well, all the research proves the more screens you have in a classroom, the lower are the basic skills of reading and writing and calculation. It's an inverse correlation. And I think that has to do with that idea that technology will amplify whatever you have. So if you have a person who's attentive and focused and efficient and creative and hardworking, and you give them technology, they'll be more that way. If you have a slightly disorganized, inattentive, inefficient, unproductive person, and you give them technology, they will become more that way. So the question is, where are kids, around the ages that we're starting to introduce this technology? 7 or 10 or 12, or can you wait till 15?
Well, there's a lot of, I'm reading articles all the time about school districts and, schools in general prohibiting kids bringing their own iPhones into the classroom. And maybe that's for a slightly different reason, but things are progressing so fast. You mentioned Chat GPT. I've been, because you have to, right? We have to kind of stay up with this stuff. I've been tinkering with it, and I mean, it's kind of blowing me away what it's able to do. And as a writing teacher, how are kids going to learn to write if all you have to do is say, "Hey, write me an essay about this"?
Yeah, I guess the first question we'd have to answer, and people ask me this: do kids even need to learn to write? Is it even a skill that you should have? And I was having breakfast with Lee Bortons recently, and she was saying, well, the Industrial Revolution brought the haves and the have-nots. It created a greater disparity in wealth. And then the Information Revolution brought the maths and the math-nots, right? And so it was the people who understood the math of things, that could do the engineering, that could bring in all the modern technology. But she said, now what we're going to have is the thinks and the think nots. Because if we outsource writing to technology, we won't be engaged in the process of learning how it does what it does. So we won't have any way to know if it's good or not. You and I could ask, put in a prompt, get ChatGPT to write something. We could read it, and if it's an area we know about, we probably would have enough general knowledge to say, did it, give me basically trustworthy, accurate information, or is there something glaringly wrong? And I've had some really ridiculous, glaringly wrong information come up in my searches. Um, but the problem is if we don't learn how to do something, we won't be able to have any wisdom, any discernment on what the AI is doing. If you're an artist, you can detect AI generated art very easily. But if you're not an artist, you might not. Same thing with music. If you are a musician, you can appreciate real music by real people written in a human, being performed by humans. But if you're not a musician, you can't really necessarily tell the difference. Same thing with writing. If you know how to do it, then you have the upper hand and you'll be able to use the tool well. If you don't know how to do it, you will be at the mercy of those who do. So that would be my argument for why should we do it. Then the question is, well, how do we teach it if nobody needs it to get the grades to pass the classes? And then the argument in schools, and there are teachers out there who are saying, well, we shouldn't teach kids to write. We should just teach them how to use, AI to do the writing that needs to be done. So, but on the other hand, now there's schools that are not only saying no phones, they're going back to blue book exams. So we can't trust that you'll go home and write a paper. So we're going to have to babysit you while you actually write something right here in class to prove that you can do it. And that, I think, is a positive. So it's complicated. I have no easy answers, though.
So you can't go backwards. So what do you recommend, for parents that you work with in classrooms and teaching homeschool kids and others? How do you recommend they approach this whole rapidly changing screen technology world?
Well, my first principle would, number one, just be as conservative as possible about giving access to kids. Like, wait as long as you can. There's no good reason for a 10-year-old to be using a device to help them, do math or write stuff. They should be doing that on paper. And then, okay, if you want to write it on paper, get it edited, type it up, and then have a document. You can email it to grandma, or you can store it, or you can print it out and put it in a book and it looks nice. But let's prolong as long as possible, in a way, the skills development period of doing things on paper, using our real brains, and not getting distracted by the technology. And one thing is as soon as you give kids access to something, whether it's as innocuous as, an online encyclopedia to look up information, or a video game, or access to hopefully a tightly controlled social media access, you'll never get it back. You can't ever go backwards, because as soon as a kid gets it, now it's a right, and you have this fight to the death over my right. The other problem I see is that parents, sometimes they themselves are very much into using screens for entertainment. Dads like to play video games, moms like social media. The kids grow up and they see, well, that's what you do when you have spare time. And so they're going to be naturally attracted. So in a way, we have to, I think, conform ourselves to the ideal that we would have for our children, and not demonstrate in our preferences the opposite of what we are hoping in their life, which is less screens, more time outside, less entertainment, more family time, board games, reading books together, real things that are human to human. rather than, a family of 5 people all sitting there looking at their own screen and not even interacting, which I know does happen and kind of hurts the heart, but it we have to start with ourselves. That would be my thought.
My daughter and I made a pledge some years ago. This was our start in that direction. We made a pledge that we would leave our phones in the car when we went into church. And so I resisted it and said, well, but I've got the Gideon Bible app on my, and I can look things, I can read this along with the sermon right there. And it's like, yeah, but I also would, get bored and be looking at other things. And so we started doing that. That was our opening salvo. But you mentioned something that I think is fascinating. When you and I were growing up, and I shouldn't assume, but when I was growing up, there was moms more or less stayed home. I lived in a neighborhood. The kids roamed kind of free all around the block, and we rode bikes and played games, and you were outside, and the only rules I had was, you either had to be home by dinner time or home by dark, whatever, and that world doesn't really exist anymore. How do we get back to where kids can live real life instead of virtual life?
Yeah, it's a tough one. You probably know of Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. And, his statement, it's been echoed by many people, is, these days parents overprotect their children in the real world and way underprotect their children in the virtual world. And I highly recommend that book for any parents, The Anxious Generation. I think the trick is community building, and because we have to do that. We have to have the play day with the other homeschoolers, and if we have to drive, so be it. Yeah, you and I could play a pickup game of kickball in the cul-de-sac, or in the park down the street, and moms didn't worry. My mother never knew where I was, and she didn't care. She didn't worry about me, 10-year-old me, riding my bike all over creation. Um, and that is no longer the case. Now we could actually get CPS called down on us if the 12-year-old and the 10-year-old walk to the park alone. So it is a different world. So I think we have to really be intentional about saying, okay, we are going to leave the house and go out and spend the day somewhere else, and we'll invite a few other families. And we know that you don't have to do school at home all day to do everything you need to do to keep up, which not even is a good idea. But with the public schools, it takes them 6 or 7 hours, because 90% of their time is discipline problems, kid management, logistics, all paper, just passing out paper. So I think the greatest thing about homeschooling, and I don't know, greatest, but it's right up there close to the greatest if it isn't, is just that freedom to say, you know what, we've done a few hours of some reading and writing, and we're just going to leave for 3 hours, and we're just going to get outside. It's relatively nice air. Maybe it's not, but let's just go somewhere. And doing that in community, I think, is also really important, and that's where we have the big plus of networks of people and homeschool groups and co-ops, and if you can get a neighborhood with a bunch of homeschoolers near each other, that's even better. And that's kind of a trend, is people saying, well, let's intentionally live near each other so we can kind of recreate these halcyon days of the 60s.
They weren't that halcyon, but they were for us kids.
Yeah.
The 60s generally are, maybe not so great in our memories. But so as a movement leader, I understand that you have been doing some exciting work of late with the folks from Florida and HSLDA in Puerto Rico. What's that all about?
Well, I got this invitation to go. Kareem, who is the I don't know, Hispanic country coordinator for HSLDA, she's so energetic and gung ho, and she knew the Puerto Ricans, and so Suzanne from Florida, and who was it? Scott Woodruff, HSLDA staff attorney. and a couple spouses. We went down there. My wife went, and they have had little groups around Puerto Rico, but they'd never really tried to get everyone together. So this was an excuse or a reason, I guess, to say, hey, everybody come together. And it's not a huge place. You can drive from one end of the island to the other in 4 hours, I think. And so we had a pretty good group. It was a lot of kids, tremendous number of kids, and a big pavilion in a botanic gardens. And it was more just let's get together and talk about how we're happy being homeschoolers. And it was funny because it was, you see all these kids, they don't know each other, but instantly, they're playing, they're on the floor, playing with their stuff they brought, or they've got balls around, and the parents are meeting each other. And then the next day we had a meeting with some of the different group leaders and the people who've been working to be sure that homeschooling stays legal and is a good option in Puerto Rico. So it was the first time I'd ever been there. Absolute great place. I liked it better than Hawaii. I think the people were nice, the beaches were great, things were they weren't terribly expensive. The only thing that tripped me up was the driving. The signs that say how far something is are in kilometers. So like, next exit 3 kilometers. But the speed limit signs are in miles per hour. And I didn't figure that out. So I'm driving along, I'm thinking 60. This is really slow. 60 kilometers an hour, and people zipping by me. And I finally figured out, this is miles per hour, but just one of those little anomalies. But I think there's a lot of hope for expanding homeschooling in Puerto Rico. The energy is super good. The law evidently is as good as most of the states here. And a lot of those kids that I talk to speak English quite well. The homeschoolers are getting much more of, I think, a good bilingual education experience. And a lot of them were using our writing program. So that was kind of fun too.
Well, it's something that, we're aware of here in the States, that homeschooling has not always been as free as it is today. And that a lot of the freedoms came about because homeschoolers banded together in, you use the word community a lot. And that's one of the most remarkable things about homeschooling, really, is that it emerged organically, and these communities were formed, and they were formed with a purpose, both educational for their children, but also to protect and preserve and advance freedom to be able to do the things that homeschoolers can do today. And that's kind of what we're interested in Puerto Rico, is helping them form a more cohesive homeschooling community. And so really thank you for your commitment to that. And when you travel around to homeschool conferences and just, lots and lots of people in the homeschooling world, what do you see as the biggest risks going forward to homeschooling in America?
I would put on the top of that list the assumption that there's no danger. Like, well, homeschooling is legal, has been for as long as I can remember. It always will be, because this is America. And a lot of the people I meet are really not aware of the fact that there are people out there who are pretty much continuously trying to bring in legislation or influence, the academic world, or bring things into the media, because they don't like, there's just some people who don't like the freedoms that other people have. And it's hard for us to understand, like, why would you want to interfere with my freedom to be free? And as long as I'm, doing decently well and not hurting anybody. But no, there's an ideology there. So, part of what I've tried to do is get out there and tell people, hey, if you want to keep these freedoms and have your children be free to homeschool their children without government interference or even big restrictions, you've got to be aware, you've got to fight. And that's why I literally tell Jim that if you are not a member of HSLDA, it's a sin of omission. And there's only one solution: repent and join. And if you can, become a lifetime member, because I view HSLDA as being the most important nonprofit organization on the entire planet, because when it comes down to the line of, are we going to be free to pass on our faith and our values and our beliefs to our children? When that's threatened, that'll be homeschool legal defense right there at that nexus between freedom and not freedom. So that's why I love what you do, and I am a lifetime member, and I encourage everyone to do that and continue to support the work there.
We appreciate that, and we appreciate you. I appreciate your lifetime membership, your support for our organization, and the times that we've spent together, different places, and just your cheerful and uplifting attitude towards. I've heard you speak at a number of conferences, and I know you're a tremendous encouragement to homeschooling parents out there all over the world to try to make their children's lives better. So we really appreciate the work that you do as well.
It's good to be on a team with you and your whole team.
Thank you. And I'll end it there. I mean, I don't know how I could end it any better. If you're not a member of HSLDA, remember, it's a theologically unsound state that you find yourself in that you could correct. But we would love to have you be a member, if you're not already, to help us protect the freedoms that we have won and to preserve the freedoms that are always constantly one legislative season away from losing. Some of you may have followed the episodes in Virginia and Illinois earlier this year, where both states, the legislatures introduced bills that would have taken away quite a bit of the freedom that we have in those two states. And in conjunction with homeschool state organizations and homeschool families in both of those states, both bills ended up dying, but we expect both to come back next legislative season when January rolls around. And so we would love to have you join with us to help us protect the freedoms in those states and others. And if they want to find out more about you and IEW, where could they go?
We have IEW.com and just a ton of information. If you wanted to hear some of my conference talks or read articles that I've written and published, you can go to andrewpudewa.com, and it redirects to a page under our IEW.com that has direct links to all of that. And then I have a podcast called The Arts of Language Podcast, and we drop an episode once a week, and they're available wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, we'll make sure to put links in our show notes. And once again, my guest today has been Andrew Pudewa, who is the founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing. And we really appreciate the work that you do. And thanks for being our guest today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Every week, HSLDA hears from hundreds of homeschool families, many of whom are facing hostility from school officials or discrimination from colleges and employers. We've helped single parents facing criminal charges for homeschooling their children, families traumatized by wrongful CPS investigations, and even a grandmother harassed by the state for homeschooling her granddaughter. By donating to HSLDA, you can help make homeschooling possible for families like these and enable our work to preserve freedom for future generations. Give today at hslda.org/donate. That's hslda.org/donate. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program. and we'll see you next time.